Dexa and I don't consider ourselves to be experts in terms of traffic safety measures. We know that you in this room are the experts in that area. What we feel like we have some expertise, though, is in the area of attitudes and behavior change, given that's what we do day in and day out in our office in terms of working with individuals. And so we, as Ward mentioned, is that we mesh these two worlds in terms of traffic safety and psychology when we embarked on our project with the Learning Disabilities Association and our subsequent business that we have on the side, the Passing Zone. And how that all started, just really briefly, is I was working with students, and I work with young children as well as adults, and I was working with students at the post-secondary level, and many of whom had some learning challenges in the area of language-based learning, who had significant difficulty getting through that knowledge test. In Alberta, there's a 66% failure rate in terms of that learner's knowledge test. And I thought, this is not rocket science, but how they were going about doing it was not the best way. So developed a system that was going to be more effective, and started showing that to people, and they were passing their exams, and they had a lot more knowledge base. And then since then, we've sold about 25,000 of them within the last 2 years, and raised over $100,000 for the Learning Disabilities Association that goes directly into literacy programs. And so what we saw from that, and how that kind of segues here into attitude changes and behavior change, is when people were provided with an alternate way of doing something. It was simply an educational process, showed them how to do this, provided them with the means of doing it, and we had a real shift in terms of behavior. It's not always that easy. We know that. So what we want to talk about today are some of the psychological underpinnings of attitude change and behavior change, the relationship, so that you can understand as administrators to what's happening at that psychological level, and why change is so difficult and so hard. And if it were only about just providing information, it would be a really simple process. So that's what we're gonna chat about. So we've got all sorts of objectives here, all of which were in your information package, so we're not going to walk through them all right now.
Okay, so what are attitudes? Okay, so it's a tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. So attitudes can be positive or negative. We have attitudes about people, whether we like someone or we don't like them. We have attitudes about issues, opinions about politics, religion, something that's happened. Objects, you might like this car, you don't like this car. You like this architecture, I like this art, you don't like it. You can also have an attitude about events. So perhaps your city is hosting the next Olympics, and you will have an attitude of whether you think that's great or whether you think that's a waste of taxpayers' money. So you can have an attitude about almost anything. As we said, it could be negative or positive. What we're going to work on, focus on in this talk mostly, is on issues such as drinking and driving, and events and experiences, like the choices you make around safe driving. Okay, so for attitudes, there's an emotional component to attitudes. So that's how you feel about an object, a person, an issue, an event, or so. You also have a cognitive component to attitudes, and so that's the thinking. When you go to buy a car, it's not the emotional sort of response you have to that beautiful red color. It's like, what's the fuel mileage it gets, what's the safety record, and things like that. And then you also have a behavioral component to an attitude that makes up an attitude. And the behavioral component is sort of how the attitude influences your behavior. So if you tend to be sort of very adventurous in that, you might decide to take a dip in the Arctic or so.
I thought that was an appropriate picture.
Yes, for a Univit.
We don't want to see any of that behavior here, though.
Yeah. So, going with the car analogy, right? When you look to buy a new car, the emotional component would be, I love the look at this, it's sleek, it's sporty, this is, I'd look so good in it. That would be the emotional component of the attitude to a particular car. The cognitive would be, what is its track record? What's the cost? What mileage does it get? Behavioral component would be, you start looking and shopping around for this particular car, and then you end up the behavior of buying the car. So all those components make up your attitude towards that particular car.
Remember those. We're going to come back to those.
Yeah.
So how do we form attitudes? The cool thing about human beings is we don't always have to experience. There is the direct approach that you can actually get in there and do something and you form an attitude. But as human beings, social learning theory says we can develop an attitude through observation by watching others as well. And that's really important when we're talking about how do we get in there and we make changes. Then it doesn't always have to be at the experiential level. So social roles and social norms have a strong influence, we know, on attitudes. And social roles are those roles that you play within whatever environment you're in, and then the social norms is sort of the general accepted ways of behavior within society.
Okay, so the question is, are attitudes predictive of behavior? And they are, but only under certain conditions. Early research in this area were having some trouble because they were finding that the behavior, the attitude did not predict the behavior, and they couldn't quite figure this out until they did further research, and these are the conditions where you can get sort of a higher correlation between attitudes and behaviors. So general attitudes predict general behavior. So if somebody generally has an attitude towards safe driving and sees them as a safe driver, overall, generally, they will do safe things. But specific attitudes will predict specific behavior. So if you took that same driver and measured his attitude for something specific like speeding, you'll get a high correlation of what his behavior will be about speeding. But a general attitude does not predict a specific behavior. So the same driver who feels he's quite safe, you can't predict, though, that he won't maybe do a specific unsafe task. So generally, he might be safe, but you can't predict accurately whether he might not pick up the phone, or he might not speed a little bit, or he might not do a U-turn at a certain street. You would have to measure his specific behavior on that task to predict his specific attitude, to predict his behavior. So basically, when you try to tap into things, the best thing is to get the specific attitude towards the specific behavior, and you'll be able to correlate it. So, behavior change. The best predictor of behavior and behavior change is what we're going to talk about now, is intention. And so this is, a lot of research has gone into this, and I think that there's a fair amount of consensus about that. Intention is made up of these three components. We've got attitude about it, so all those things that Dex has already been talking about. We have the social or the subjective norms, and we'll tell you what that is, and then the perceived behavioral control. Social or subjective norms have to do with, well, we talked about what that social norms, so the norms within the society, the rules that guide your behavior, but the subjective norms, and this is particularly, I think, important when we're talking about young drivers, is how you feel your behavior will be interpreted or accepted by others is going to help frame how you're going to behave. And we know that for young drivers that is an issue. And then the perceived behavioral control is how much control do you think you're going to have over being able to engage in that behavior. And let me give you a bit of a how easy
scenario.
Or how hard is it to do this behavior?
So we're going to talk about Sarah. And we're going to talk about drinking and driving, given obviously that I think in everybody's mind, we have made huge gains in that over the past 20 or 30 years, but we still have a ways to go in terms of changing that. So as many young people, I know I have, my youngest is 18 and my oldest is 23, and I got a 21-year-old, and Dex is almost exactly, her kids are exactly the same ages. So we've been seeing this and the difference in attitude from when we were growing up. So Sarah has an attitude that drinking and driving, not a good thing to do. Absolutely not an accepted behavior. So she's in elementary school, she's talked about it. In junior high, as a high school student, absolutely not taboo. In terms of the subjective norms, her friends are thinking the same sort of way. So that she knows that if she was drinking and driving, her friends would be against that as well, and it wouldn't be acceptable. And then perceived behavioral control. So they're planning on going out that evening, and they all got dropped off at the bar. In Edmonton, it would be dropped off on White Avenue, and off you would go, and they all have cab money. So there's an element of control. There's not going to be much of an issue. So what we know then is the behavioral intention then is going to be that there's likely not going to be some drinking and driving, and so that the behavior is probably not going to happen. Let's just change that scenario a tiny bit. So we have the same attitude toward the behavior. Sarah's not different than she was before. What we have is Sarah goes out with her friends, who again have the same subjective norms. But her friends leave earlier on in the evening. Sarah's met somebody, kind of a cool guy that she thinks is pretty nice, and he likes her. And so she's hanging out at the bar with him. And her friends are gone, so that the cab money now, it's a little bit different because you don't have shared cab money anymore. And this fellow that she's met has consumed alcohol, and he does have a car there. So now what we have is we have a different intention happening. So what's likely going to happen in that scenario, or what could happen within that scenario? Does it change? Yeah, there's a good chance it can change. Sarah hasn't changed, but we have other conditions, and now we have behavioral change, and that's a huge issue that we see happening within society. That's not the only reason for drinking and driving, but it does form part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. So as Michele sort of explained some of the reasons why the attitude doesn't always reflect the behavior, to go into a bit more detail, that they're more likely to behave according to their attitudes under certain conditions. So when their attitudes are a result of personal experience, so we mentioned before, it's direct experience. It's sort of someone's attitude towards speeding is going to be different if they received the speeding ticket versus hearing about their friend receiving the speeding ticket. So if their attitude is a result of personal experience, when they expect a favorable outcome, so when they think that something good is going to come out of it. For example, if their attitude is, I'm going to study for the test because I think I'll get a good mark. When the attitudes are repeatedly expressed, so they become habitual, they become more entrenched. So if you're a person that around the water cooler at the office, you're always talking about, yeah, you're totally against drinking and driving, you shouldn't be doing that, then there's more chance that you're going to align your behavior with your often expressed opinions, and you're going to stick to them. Also, when you stand to win or lose something due to the issue, so that's the personal impact. So when there's a personal impact, for example, of a young man, if his job is sort of contingent on having a car, making deliveries and that, he's less likely to risk that by doing something that would lose his car or get in an accident or so. So when you put those all together, then the attitude they have will be reflecting the behavior.
Sanctions are whether you are going to get a ticket. Are you going to win, or are you going to lose something? Or are you going to be rewarded for good driving behavior? Can also help form, you're going to have your attitude more in line with your behavior.
There's also other things that can affect the behaviors. So additional factors is mood. If you're in a bad mood, you might have a certain attitude, but if you're in a bad mood, you're going to take more risks. Ironically, and this is where it always gets complicated, if you're in a good mood, you might be feeling really good, the sun is out, you're playing the music loud, and you're going to be starting to speed more. So you could also take, different risks depending on the mood. Self-esteem can affect what behaviors you decide to do or whether you shift your behavior from your attitude. Low self-esteem, you might perceive some rejection from your peers if you're hanging around people that don't, that sort of say, oh, what's the big deal? Like, you haven't had that many, go drink and drive. If you perceive that you're going to have rejection, you may not stick to your values. There's a flip side to that, too. If you have too much high self-esteem, then...
And you're not swayed by other people very easily who are trying to push you in the positive direction.
So again, these are all factors. Of course, we all know alcohol and drug use is going to have impact. It impairs our judgment, and it impairs our long-term thinking for what would be the long-term consequences of this decision. Motivation. Now, the top three contribute to motivation. Motivation is also contingent on the barriers you face. How hard or easy is it to follow through on what I believe in? So let's say you wanted to go to the gym after work, and you've been doing that pretty regularly, and you really believe in it, you're really committed to it, but the boss asked you to work late, you're really hungry, the gym is like halfway across town, the barriers are getting high. There's a good chance your motivation is going to be lower than what it takes to get there, and you won't follow through on your attitude. Personality traits can also have an impact. People who are impulsive, they're not thinking, they just kind of, in the moment, they know what they believe, but they just go with the flow. What's easiest at the moment, and just go with it fast. Teenagers tend to do that a lot.
Well, and other, things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's not about knowing what to do, it's about doing what you know. Right? You might know all the rules of the road, and you might have all of the knowledge and all of the skills, but do you implement it when it needs to be implemented? So doing what you know is a big problem. And of course, that's one of the problems with alcohol and drug use as well. It's not that you don't have the information, it's that you do not utilize that information. So how do attitudes and behaviors interact? What's interesting is that attitudes don't always come before behaviors. Sometimes we have behaviors that we engage in a behavior, and that we have to shift our attitude in order to adjust for that behavior. And we're going to go into lots of detail about that. But we know, what we know is it's not one isn't always leading to the other. We can have a behavior coming first. And in terms of cognitive dissonance, how many people are familiar with this term? It is something that's thrown out there a fair amount, yeah. And Dexa and I, the more that we did research, and certainly within our practices, we are very aware of the idea of cognitive dissonance. But the more we spent examining it and looking into it, we understand of the importance of this. And the importance of understanding it, I think, when you're looking at planning and understanding why people don't conform, why good people can do bad things. And I think that's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. So cognitive dissonance is all about any time, and you can think about this maybe personally, any time that you've done something stupid. I do them on a daily basis. Thankfully, mostly they're just little things. To that, no. They're mostly little things, but sometimes they're fairly big things. Or immoral. And thankfully, I don't typically engage in that kind of behavior, but whenever we do something stupid or immoral, then what we have in that moment then is a misalignment between our attitudes and our behavior. And when we have that misalignment, we have something called dissonance. We feel crappy. You have that bad feeling. And as human beings, we don't tolerate that very well, and so we want to get rid of it. We want to get rid of that dissonance. And there's lots of information and lots of stories through history of great people, very good people, doing very bad things because of that dissonance they felt and that need then to get rid of that. So in order to reduce this uncomfortable feeling, we engage in certain behaviors.
You're going to set up those two
yes,
scenarios?
And I've got two scenarios. So these are kind of common things that might happen. Punctual. Are some of you punctual people within this audience? Timely, arrive, absolutely. I like to be on time. So we have a boss who has been really ensuring that his employees or his colleagues are on time to meetings. The meeting is supposed to start at 9 o'clock. In this scenario, we have the fellow maybe reading his newspaper a tad bit too long, gets engaged in something, and gets to work just a few minutes late. So meeting that he said everybody needs to be on time for, he's walked in 10 minutes late. And we also have scenarios